Welcome to the Crash Course in Herbicide Calculations, hosted by USDA, NRCS, and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. I'm Taylor McCumber, the Zone 3 Range Management Specialist based out of Corpus Christi. My hosting partner is Dr. Megan Clayton, an Extension Range Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service based at the Corpus Christi Research and Extension Center and with the new Department of Rangeland, Wildlife, and Fisheries Management at Texas A&M. We also have Extension Range Specialist Dr. Bob Lyons online today to share about a new app he's developed in just a bit. Our game plan is to cover information on how to calculate herbicide mixes, then move on to estimating the cost for a project. We will also cover different aspects of equipment important for effective control of unwanted plants with herbicide, and in our training session with a quick look at the ERM 1466 Weed and Brush Control Reference Guide. So Megan, would you like to kick us off by covering how we typically treat noxious plants with herbicide and what should be included in a herbicide mixture?
Sure. All right. Yes, so we're going to start out with the very basics. Of course, this is just a review for all of you, I know, but I wanted to cover that we do, of course, have 3 individual plant treatment methods that we're going to be discussing today and talking about how to calculate those mixes, our cut stump, our stem or our basal treatments, and then the leaf or the foliar treatments. For broadcast treatments, obviously, we only have the leaf or the foliar treatments at this time. So for cut stump, it's something that's nice because you can do it any time of year, and it's also a great treatment option for hayed lands because a lot of times people don't want to leave those trees or those skeletons standing for a full year, and so their only option really is to go to a cut stump treatment. This can be done this winter, which is always a plus, but it does take a lot of extra labor up front because you're removing that entire tree as low and as flat to the ground as possible, and then spraying that cut stump surface and any remaining stem that's on the plant. So you don't need a lot of chemical mix. There's no size limitation on the tree. If it does have multiple stems, you do have to be careful that you're treating every multiple stem, but really 100% effective. So the stem spray or the basal applications where you're applying that chemical mix 12 to 18 inches high all the way around that stem down to the ground. No need to let it puddle up. This can also be done any time of year, but you do have to leave those skeletons standing in the field for at least 1 full year before you remove them so that chemical can continue to work on the bud zone underneath the soil surface. You can do a stem diameter up to 4, maybe 6 inches if the bark is very smooth, but not anything larger than that. If you have something larger than that, you're probably talking about a cut stump method. It's also interesting, like in this picture that you see up here, what we typically use to do a stem or a cut stump treatment is Remedy and Diesel or Triclopyr and Diesel. And that is an ester which tends to volatilize. So you can see that tree in the background's a little bit dinged up. And that's the one caveat with stem and cut stump treatment is that you don't want to apply those to trees when it's really hot outside because the possibility of that chemical to volatilize, even if you apply it correctly, and to ding up some of the more desirable trees that are above them. And finally, our leaf or our foliar treatment is something that needs to be put out at the specific right time of year. So it's a little bit trickier on timing than our stem or cut stump treatment. We need to know when that tree is actively making carbohydrates or sugars and storing those into the bud zone underneath the soil surface so that we can kill that tree. So we're looking for carbohydrate translocation. That's why sometimes you hear mesquite is best to spray in the late spring, early summer. Weesatch may be better to spray in the spring sometimes, but usually in the fall, like October timeframe. These different timeframes are when that tree is actively translocating the carbohydrates. And we need to know that the soil temperature is high enough that that tree is actively growing and that it's not flowering, beaning, or putting on new leaf, because at that time it's using its carbohydrates out, not down. And so it probably won't kill as many trees as it would if you waited until those trees were in a more mature leaf, better condition, not actively doing any of those things. The skeletons for a foliar treatment still have to remain in the field for 1 full year. So you have to look at them. A lot of people don't like that. Personally, I do because I feel like I accomplished something. The sunlight can still get through that canopy or where the canopy used to be and grow some forage. So it's still a win-win, even if the skeleton's standing in the field. Okay, so what's in the mix for all these different treatments? When we're talking about a leaf or a foliar, an individual plant treatment on a leaf, the chemical, of course, is important and it's going to be given to you as a percent. And so sometimes that throws people off because we can't tell how many trees they would have per acre. And it's not like a broadcast application where you're putting that same amount of material over the entire field, no matter how many trees are there. It's very individualistic and it's hard to know the amount. So for that reason, you're given the amount for a chemical in a percentage. You'll also always want to add in an adjuvant. This is typically just 0.25% of a non-ionic surfactant. A surfactant is what cuts that surface tension so those balls of chemical don't beat up on the leaf. It'll become smooth and it'll get more into that leaf so it can be taken down to that bud zone to kill the plant. The NIS or non-ionic surfactant needs to be an 80 to 90% active ingredient. So that's what you're looking for. Otherwise, it does not matter what you purchase for that. There are some chemicals that will call for or suggest you use an MSO/OS. That's a methylated seed oil. Those would be at a different rate. So always read the label of what's considered appropriate for that specific adjuvant that you're adding if it's not just your typical NIS. You'll also need dye. Dye is what helps us make sure that we cover all of the leaves until they're wet but not dripping. I talked to a man even yesterday who said that he's just been trying to get as much of the leaves and some really thick weesatch as he can. And unfortunately, a lot of it's not defoliated. So we know that that tree will not die because it still has leaf after a few weeks of application. So very important that you add in that blue dye, cover all of those leaves till they're wet but not dripping in order to have consistent translocation of that chemical down to the bud zone. And of course, when we do a leaf or a foliar application, we always put it in water. Water is going to help that get onto the leaf, get good coverage, but not something like diesel that might make the leaves defoliate faster because that's not the goal. The goal is to allow that chemical to sit on the leaf for as long as possible for it to be taken down into the tree. When we talk about foliar broadcast applications, it's basically the same setup. We're doing the same NIS, non-ionic surfactant, methylated seed oil. A lot of them call for a MSO/OS, which is like organosilicone surfactant. I hope I don't have to say that one again. But new chemicals such as our new Invora that's out calls for or prefers in all situations an MSO/OS, but for broadcasts, it's needed. So that might be something like a dynamic, which is actually suggested at 4 ounces or 5 ounces per acre. And so you've got to read these labels to know how much of that has to be included. When you go broadcast, of course, we don't use a dye. Dye is gross enough for individual plant treatments. So no need to do that on a broadcast basis, but again, only in water. Finally, we get over to our stem and our cut stump applications. Those are typically done in diesel when we mix them with triclopyr ester, and that's what Remedy Ultra is. So when we do a stem or a basal application, we're mixing up 15 to 25% triclopyr or Remedy Ultra with the rest diesel. And, you know, a lot of times people wonder if they should do 15 or 25, and it's pretty simple. If you've got a place full of seedlings, small little plants under 1.5 inches in diameter, smooth bark, you could get away with 15%. Typically you have a mix, and so you'll want to go ahead and mix up for the 25% Remedy Ultra, 75% diesel. And then I do suggest you add in a dye. A lot of times when you're spraying it right onto that bark, it's going to split, and that dye will help you make sure that you get that bark really well coated. For a cut stump, because you're opening up that entire wound, you got the entire cut stump surface to treat, you only need to mix up 15% of that triclopyr, 85% diesel. So pretty simple mixtures. I should say that there are some caveats coming. One is if you're in an area where you have redberry juniper, it's a totally different mixture in water with tordon and a surfactant. Also, the new Invora that I talked about a minute ago can do stem and cut stump applications in water with an MSO/OS. So those are the two caveats. Otherwise, we're usually looking at doing most of our hardwood species with that Remedy and diesel mix. All right, so I think Taylor's going to talk to you about how you would actually calculate the actual numbers in these mixes.
So there are a lot of resources and apps out there, but it's important for us to know how to come up with these numbers on our own to make sure, we're getting reasonable calculations. And so the number one thing you need to know, as we have written here, is 120 ounces per gallon. And then calculate the needs for 1 gallon of mix first. And then don't forget, if it's a percentage, then you need to convert or divide by 100. So this is a common example using Sendera at 1% on mesquite for IPT foliar treatments. So first you're going to add some water in your container, and then you're going to add the Sendera at 1%. And to figure out how many ounces per gallon, you take the 128 ounces, multiply that by your 1%, you get 128, and then since it's a percentage, you divide by 100 and you get 1.28 ounces per gallon. So for your adjuvant, you have 0.25% out of 128 ounces. Multiply that by 0.25 and you get 32. And then once again, you divide by 100 and you get 0.32 ounces per gallon. So your blue dye, you have 0.5%, 128 ounces times 0.5% is 64. And then you divide by 100 because it's a percent, and you get 0.64 ounces per gallon. And then you fill your water to the gallon mark. So this is a screenshot of the Sendera label, which you can go online, search, you can find this online pretty easily. Highlighted here is the maximum application rate. In this example, Sendera's max use rate is 1.75 pints or 28 ounces. So for a 50-acre place being cost shared, the maximum amount of Sendera they could legally use for the job would be 11 gallons of Sendera. Otherwise, the estimates of the amount of mix needed to cover the plants properly would have to be done and multiplied by the number of plants. The next one is a common example using Remedy with triclopyr and diesel as a mesquite stem spray application. So you can use 15 to 25%, as Megan stated earlier, depending on the size of the stems. But in this example, we'll assume the mixture of the sizes and mix 25% to be able to cover everything. So Remedy Ultra at 25%, 100 out of 128 ounces, multiply that by 25, you get 3,200. Divide it by 100 because, once again, it's a percentage, and you get 32 ounces per gallon. The blue dye, 0.5%. So you take your 128 ounces, multiply that by 0.5, you get 64. 64 divided by 100 is 0.64 ounces per gallon. So you know how much dye you need there. And then you fill your diesel to the gallon mark and you mix it well. This is a common example of cut stump treatments on mesquite. You only need 15% triclopyr because you're opening up that entire cut stump surface before applying the mixture. So 15% of 128 ounces, you get 1920, and you divide that by 100, and you get 19.2 ounces per gallon that you need. And then your blue dye, 0.5%, 128 ounces times your 0.5, you get 64. And then you divide it by 100 and you have 0.64 ounces per gallon that is needed. And then once again, you fill the diesel to the gallon mark and you mix well. So if you're broadcasting mesquite and let's say it's 150 acres with Sendero at 28 ounces per acre, there's spray rigs put out 20 gallons per acre. So we're going to make an assumption that that's the rate, and they have a 50-gallon tank. So first thing, which we've mentioned here, is you know how much they're putting out per acre, and you take your 50-gallon tank and you divide that by 20 gallons per acre, and you get 2.5 acres sprayed per tank load. And then to calculate the chemical that's needed per tank, you take your 2.5 acres, covered, and you multiply that by 28 ounces per acre, because that's what's required up here for Sendero as broadcast foliar, and you get 70 ounces per tank. In the adjuvant, it'll vary, with the product, so be sure and read the label there. And then you take your 150 acres sprayed, and then you multiply that by the 28 ounces of Sendero per acre. You get 4,200 ounces per 128 ounce per gallon equals 32.8 gallons of Sendero. We have Dr. Bob Lyons, professor and extension range specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, here to share with us about a brand new Brush Busters cost calculator app that is in the works. Thank you for spending some time with us, Dr. Lyons.
Several years ago, there was some Brush Buster publications that were published or put together to estimate cost of different individual plant treatments. And so those were pretty static because they weren't revised. And so, in other words, the cost was fixed basically on cost of herbicides several years ago. So what Dr. Clayton and I decided to do was to look at develop an app that would be very flexible and would be driven by user inputs. So it's the Brush Buster cost calculator, and it's in development right now as an app. We expect it to be functional by the first part of December, possibly. On the screen here, we're showing required entries designated in red. It'll look different in the app. I'm not sure exactly what it's going to show it, but so you'd enter the herbicide name, and that's really for the user's benefit, because this job or case can be saved and you can pull it up later. So whatever herbicide name, say it's Tordon or Sendero, whatever it is, you enter that name, and then you enter the cost per gallon, so dollars in gallon. And then you enter the herbicide rate, which in this case is 1%. And then you enter the spray volume plant. And this is where you're going to have to maybe do some experiment on some typical plants that you're going to spray. So the way you would do that is spray several plants that are the size that you're going to treat, and calculate how much you sprayed per plant. So for example, if you use 60 ounces and you sprayed 10 plants, that would work out to 6 ounces per plant. So when you enter information there, what it does is it calculates herbicide per plant. So this app is going to allow us to enter for leaf sprays. It's going to allow us to enter as many as 3 different herbicides. We typically wouldn't need that many. The most we'd probably need would be 2. But so, for example, for herbicide B here, let's just say that it costs $90. $70 a gallon. Our herbicide rate still 1%. Spray volume still 6%, 6 ounces. So it calculates that particular herbicide would cost us 3 ounces, or 0.03 cents per plant. So if you don't enter anything, it won't calculate a cost for that particular herbicide. So the same thing with herbicide 3. If we needed it, if you leave these entries blank, it won't any of these entries. It won't calculate a cost. And then we scroll down to the. I entered a cost of $21 per gallon at a rate of 0.25%, and it calculates the cost of that surfactant per plant. And then we enter the dye. $41 per gallon at a rate of 0.25%. And then labor cost. In this particular example, we entered $14 per hour, 2 laborers, and we estimate that it would take them 30 minutes or half an hour to treat that 1 acre. And then you scroll down again, and so it's calculated as total spray cost per plant, which is almost 0.049, almost 5 cents per plant. We need, if we're going to calculate the total cost per acre, we need to know how many plants per acre. And so we've entered 100 here as an example. And the way to calculate the number or estimate the number of plants per acre is to mark off a 66-foot square and count the plants in that square and do that several times across the area. And then calculate the average of those measurements. So that's a way to get an estimate of how many plants per acre. And so the spray cost per acre would be $4 and almost 95 cents per plant per acre. That's just the spray cost. And then if you add the labor cost in, the total cost would be $18.95 per acre. And you can change any of these entries as you go to look at different scenarios. And as I said, the app will allow you to save this job and look at it later on. So that's the leaf spray. And the stem spray cut stump is similar. In this case, we're just allowing one herbicide to be entered because we don't have any applications where we put two different herbicides for stem spray or cut stump. So we enter the cost of the herbicide. In this case, we're looking at $70 a gallon. Our rate for the stem spray is 25%. The spray volume per plant is half an ounce. That gives us a cost of about almost 7 cents a plant. And then in this case, we're looking at, say for example, we've got a water carrier that would for Envora, for example, that would be a zero cost. In this case, we're going to use diesel at $3. So 25 plus 75, that's 100% in the gallon. So that's 0.008, almost 0.9 cost per plant for the carrier cost. So for example, if we are going to use water, we just would delete that diesel cost and it would calculate no carrier cost. We're estimating water to be free. So let's just put that back in there. We're looking at diesel as a carrier. And then if we come down here, the surfactant cost, if we're using diesel, we would have no surfactant cost. If we're using Envora in water, we would have a surfactant cost. If we're going to use a dye, we enter the dye cost per gallon and the rate at 0.25 or 0.5, whatever you're going to use. And then again, we enter the labor cost, and it calculates a total spray cost per plant of almost 8 cents a plant. And then we've got 100 plants per acre. Again, the spray cost per acre would be $7.75 for just the spray. And then with the labor, it would be $21.75 per acre. So that's basically how it works. All the calculations are behind the scenes. So all you have to do, all the user has to do is enter the required values. That's pretty much it.
Thank you, Dr. Lyons. We're going to move on to some equipment considerations that can influence the effectiveness of herbicide applications, basically just as much as the calculations can. So first, I'd like to cover a bit about sprayer calibration. So calibration is something that most applicators know that they should be doing, but they may not do it quite as often as they should. They should generally be doing it once a year. And with broadcast herbicide application, it makes it impossible to know how much chemical or adjuvant or how much to add to their tank if they don't exactly know how much the sprayer is putting out. So in this example, The broadcast herbicide application calls for a quart per acre of chemical. It's probably pretty easy to assume that the amount of herbicide will vary greatly if your sprayer puts out 10 gallons per acre or 30 gallons per acre. The example demonstrates that in a 100-gallon tank, you need 10 quarts of chemical per tank if you were to put out 10 gallons of spray volume per acre, versus on the other side, if you look, 3.3 quarts of chemical per tank if you put out 30 gallons of spray volume. Thus, the chemical needs to be more diluted. So here is an example of an app that can calibrate your sprayer. It came from Clemson and walks you through calibration of a boom or a boomless nozzle spray system. And here are some similar steps. The extension has a handout that can be found at southtexasrangelands.mu.edu. Publications tab, sprayer calibration guide. On page 1, it goes through on how to calibrate a boom sprayer. Page 2, it shows the boomless sprayer calibration. And then on page 3, it's for a UTV or ATV spray rig. And since it's difficult to go a steady speed, a lot of the time with the ATV or UTV, it's probably easier to just work backwards and find out how fast you should attempt to drive. So if you put how many gallons per acre of spray volume you would like to put out and then work backwards, it should give you how fast you should be driving. And once again, this is available at the website here at the top. Now I'm going to pass it back to Megan so she could cover equipment selection.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right. There's a lot of things I think people ask us questions a lot of times, or they talk about what equipment they're going to be using for a job. And sometimes it's hard to know how to advise them or if what they're going to do is the best scenario. So I just wanted to run through a few different equipment options and things that you might want to look for or think about being a part of an equipment package that would make that spray job more effective. The first one is, of course, you could use a boom. And some people already have a boom set up that they use regularly for weeds. And usually they can get that boom high enough to spray most weeds, but as thrilled as this technician looks in this picture, um, this unit right here can get that boom up pretty high, but we went to spray weesatch one time and it wasn't able to be raised to be at least 18 inches over the tallest part of the tallest weesatch tree. And so as a result, it clipped the tops of those trees. None of those trees completely defoliated. And by the time I went back to check them, they were completely leafed out again. So coverage is very important. And the way those sprayer nozzles work for weed spraying, they're fanning out. So you've got to get that a good 18 inches above your target plant height. That way you know that that pattern is going out appropriately and is going to cover it well. Otherwise, you might as well not do it, as we did experience, because you're not going to get the job done. Another option is to use boomless nozzles, and this is quite honestly what Dr. Lyons and I use the most of for our research, particularly this boom buster nozzle. It's a very small nozzle that can be mounted in a couple of different ways. This is my old four-wheeler rig, and you can see off to one side I have it mounted, so it's spraying an arc out about 20 feet, but it's probably more like about 16 feet effective swath width because the droplets are huge at the farthest side. You can imagine to sling it that far, they have to be pretty big. Dr. Lyons actually has a four-wheeler mounted with two in the center. So right in the middle, he's got one going in each direction. And so essentially he's driving over what he's spraying, but he's able to get twice the swath width of what I'm getting with my one off to one side. But mine's really set up to spray fence lines or senderos or the edge of pastures. So different things might fit different situations. They also have boomless nozzles like this cluster jet that's used a lot of times for weeds anyway. And it's difficult because it has a lot of different droplet sizes going out of it. So it's not always the best coverage, but it is an option if somebody doesn't have a boom or can set up a small system on a UTV or an ATV that they already own. All right. And also, you want to make sure that you know how fast you're going. So it's important that even if you're spraying off of an ATV or a UTV, that the speed is accounted for. We know when we calibrate that it's easier, like Taylor just went over to start with, okay, how much material do you want to put out? And then work backwards to figure out how fast you can go, because it's a very difficult thing to go a steady speed on these things, especially if it's a rough pasture. But it's very important that you're putting out 20 to 30 psi. In order to know that, you have to have a pressure gauge in a location where you can actually see it while you're driving. So there's a lot of things to think about. And then we usually put out 10 to 30 gallons per acre with these rigs when we're spraying broadcast. Next slide. I didn't put a picture of it in here, I don't think, but we do have the option to do quick connects on the back of these rigs, so that instead of spraying broadcast, you can have them go through a hose, and you can use a sprayer wand and not have to carry that chemical on your back. So another adaptation that people probably often think about. If things are so high that you can't spray it from a ground rig and you have to go aerial, of course, there's two different options: a fixed wing or a helicopter. I like helicopters because they can be a little bit more specific about where they're dropping their chemical. But of course, an airplane or fixed wing is going to be cheaper because they just kind of fly in and cover a large swath of area all at one time. So they're a little bit more price, but a little bit better for more sensitive areas, particularly. Or if you have areas you're trying to avoid, like big oak mottes, then the helicopter might be better. But one thing we don't think about a lot is talking to these helicopter or fixed wing pilots about what droplet size they're putting out. We might make sure that they're putting out the right volume of spray material per acre. And then oftentimes that's 4 to 5 gallons per acre. And we're going to look at some research we've done on that. But droplet size is something else that we need to focus on. For individual plant sprays, I really like these backpack sprayers. This orange harness right here is actually an add-on. It costs about $40 from Forestry Supply. I always tell people, if you're like my dad, you never have a suggestion for what present to get you for holidays. So that might be a good gift, because those padded straps that it comes with aren't all that effective if you spray more than one day in a row. You can also add your own hose on here aftermarket. You can buy longer wands, which makes it a lot easier. You don't have to bend over as much. And you have a little bit more reach, so you can stay out of the way of wind if you're spraying an individual plant spray with a leaf application. And then these nozzles are very specific depending on what type of application you're doing. So here are the different types of nozzles. And on a stem or a cut stump treatment, we're trying to direct a single stream onto that cut stump surface or the stem. So we're looking at usually a T-jet nozzle as an X1 or an X2. Now, they have done studies where they time it and they spray out the amount of material. And if they're using a leaf spray type of nozzle for a cut stump application, they could be wasting up to 80% of their spray mix, which is big time when you talk about the money involved, not to mention the time involved in remixing all of that. So using the correct nozzle is something that's sometimes overlooked, and people think they can just adjust what nozzle they have on there. But 9 times out of 10, people adjust it wrong. We're looking for a single spray, a stream spray for your stem or cut stump. We're looking for a very wide pattern, or a larger hole actually, for our leaf applications, so that we can cover more leaf more quickly, but not waste any of that chemical. And then, of course, over on the left-hand side, you see a weed sprayer, so that flat nozzle. That's what's directing those things out in kind of a cone shape when they're on a boom. So you're probably familiar with seeing that, but those are the ones I said you really need to have a good 18 inches over the tallest target plant that you're trying to cover. So I mentioned that there are some things you might want to think about as far as droplet size, or the amount of volume that you're putting out, even if you do that by air. And we did a few studies that kind of looked into this that were really interesting. So we knew that honey mesquite mortality from a study that was done by WisNet way back in 1993 showed that droplet size was less important if you have higher spray volumes. So we did this, we had trouble getting good coverage on plants like Weesatch, and we were putting out 10 gallons of mix per acre instead of 4 or 5. I don't suggest you ever go under 4. If people are spraying under 4, it's more likely that they're doing something like electrostatic spraying, where they kind of charge those particles to go out. And what we find in rangelands with varying heights of trees and weeds is that it's difficult to get those to penetrate a canopy with that little spray volume, because we're not talking about like a farm field where you would have all of your plants at a single height at a certain time. So under 4 is not advised, but is it necessary to spray 10 gallons per acre? Because that really ups your price if you're talking about having, say, a helicopter spray it, because they're likely going to have to spray that pattern twice. So we wanted to know, is this consistent with other studies on weesach or on mesquite? And what about plants like weesach that we know are more difficult to cover? So this is data that was done with a study in conjunction with DuPont on mesquite aerial broadcasting 1 year after treatment. And you can see down at the bottom, we have apparent kill. Above that, you see the numbers 412, 404, 443, 545, 596, and then 796. Those are the droplet size in microns. And on the bottom is the gallons per acre. So we tried 3, 6, and then 10 for the rest of them. So you can see that even when we had lower spray volume or gallons per acre going out, we didn't see a drop in the efficacy or the ability for us to control those plants. We still had over 80% control. What we did see affected on mesquite was the droplet size. And it seems like once you approach that 600 micron size or larger, the particles are not able to effectively cover that tree. So larger droplets aren't able to effectively cover that tree. So unfortunately, when we go too far to the left and we get a very, very small micron, we have issues with drift. And so a lot of people aren't going to want to go too small. But what we showed is anywhere up to about 600 micron level worked out pretty well. And after that, you saw your efficacy start to decline. Aerial weesach droplet size study. This was 2 years after treatment. So what we were looking at again is the same sort of deal. We did 4 gallons per acre and 10 gallons per acre with a 400 micron droplet size. And then we did 10 gallons per acre of about a 600 micron. And then the maximum, which would be like a very coarse droplet. And what we found is that you get pretty good control until, again, you start to go over that 600 micron size, and then it starts to drop off, irregardless of the amount of spray volume that you're putting out. So I hate to say that a lot of our efforts in putting out 10 gallons per acre of spray volume were likely not necessary, but that's sort of what this data is showing. And so here's another way to look at it as a box and whisker graph. So the X is the average, and range of it is across all different sites where we had data. So the lowest you would find it is for 10 gallons, that very coarse droplet is about 35% control all the way up to 58% control or so. And then you can see that they're a lot tighter when you get to smaller droplet sizes. And again, once we got to that 600 micron, not only was there a wider pattern, a wider range of control numbers, but then it drastically dropped off when we went to a very coarse droplet size, despite putting out 10 gallons per acre. All right, so cleaning the equipment. This is something that we don't often get asked about necessarily, but could be something really important for you to impart on your people. Cleaning equipment is very important because that will help the longevity or how long this equipment is going to be useful. And it will also help it to maintain the pressures and the capacity to put out these chemicals at the level we need them in order for them to be effective. So it's pretty simple. You actually just rinse the equipment with water. Most people rinse with water. I do know some that say they never do. They just even let that chemical sit in there. And the problem is a lot of our herbicides are very acidic, and those acids are going to start to eat away at a lot of those those rubber rings and things that are really holding that equipment together over time. So after every use, it should be rinsed with water, and then a solution of diluted ammonia should be run through that machine. And that's at a 1% rate. So we're talking about 1.3 ounces per gallon of water mixed. So pretty easy. And I'm talking about the ammonia that you can buy at HEB over the counter. Rinse again with water after you do that. And then also you want to take off your nozzles and rinse those out real well. Never use a wire brush or get it real aggressive with scrubbing them, because you'll actually mess up the holes on those nozzles. But definitely rinsing them is a really good practice, because you don't want that chemical to be sitting in there and wearing on your filters and your nozzles over time. Great, and I'm going to turn it back over to Taylor to introduce the ERM 1466.
We'd like to cover some information about a go-to resource, or one of the go-to resources for chemical mixes in Texas, which is the ERM 1466, Chemical Weed and Brush Control Reference Guide for Rangeland. So basically, it's a data repository for AgriLife Extension, but for NRCS, it is one of our approved resources for herbicide recommendations. Anyone can submit data packets on certain plant species, weed or brush, with enough replicas over time and space, and then it has to be reviewed and approved by the Texas A&M Herbicide Use Committee before it's added. It is updated more frequently because it's updated electronically, and as I mentioned, it's a USDA technical guide, and it is available at the AgriLife bookstore or South Texas Rangelands.edu. So Megan's going to cover some specific information that you can find within the ERM 1466 that you might find helpful.
Well, we want to point out, of course, and I know a lot of you've already used this book for years, but there is some confusion over it and how it should be best used or easiest used. So we list everything by herbicide common name, and that is not how people typically talk about a chemical. The reason we do that is because we're not going to promote one brand. That's just not our thing. We promote whatever chemical works. And so a lot of times there's several product names that might be that same chemical and be just as applicable. And so that's why it's listed in this way. So all throughout the book, you'll see everything listed as the herbicide common name, but you can always go to this chart. I think this is on page 2 or 3, and it's got the product name right there. And what's really important to pay attention to is that it actually has that active ingredient or acid equivalent. And for example, the acid equivalent of picloram, which is like Tordon 22K, is 2 pounds per gallon. And so I think I have, yeah, okay. So here's the Tordon label. And where we get that is I just blew up that section that talks about active ingredient. And you see picloram, that's what Tordon is. This one is 24.4% picloram, but that's not what you're looking at when you're wanting to compare a generic herbicide to, say, the common herbicide that's used like Tordon, and you want to know if that's okay to switch those two out. You've got to look at that acid equivalent. And in our book, we're saying 2 pounds per gallon. So if your generic says that it has a picloram acid equivalent of 2 pounds per gallon, you could absolutely use that, of course, if it's labeled for use on range and pasture. But anyway, that's the way to figure out if you're allowed to substitute another chemical for one that's listed in the book. So another thing you might consider is that on the labels, a lot of times it can be a little bit confusing. For example, this is a Tordon label that says that woody plants and vines controlled is mesquite. And we know that if we put just Tordon on mesquite, that it does not have a very high effectiveness rating. And so that would be more of a suppression technique. So there's a couple of different things we're looking at. People have different ideas of what controlled is. And the label might say controlled, but that might not mean that those plants will end up dead. So it's important to always consult the book. And our book has effectiveness ratings from very high all the way down to low. And those are what will kind of clue you in as to whether or not that's a treatment that you would want to invest in for NRCS, because especially in times when people are trying to decide from a long list, it's best to look at what's the highest effectiveness and go with that one. Suppression is where we would defoliate the plant. We could go out even a few weeks after application and see that those leaves are defoliated off the plant. And a lot of times, I know y'all have this too, producers say, look, I killed the tree. Like, well, you defoliated the tree. We can defoliate trees with a lot of inappropriate chemicals. And so that only tells us that the tree was covered well. So the application went well. It wasn't shaded out, nothing kept it from getting on the leaf. The leaves did fall off within a few weeks. We usually do our defoliation ratings at about 3 months after initial application. But you can't tell whether or not that tree was apparently killed, you have apparent mortality or not, until 1 year after application, and especially at 2 years after application. So let me give you an example. I keep bringing up Weesatch, but that's because it's one of the most difficult trees we deal with in my region. If you don't have it, congratulations. But Weesatch, people will put graze on next on Weesatch. That is labeled as a suppression. Even if you look at graze on next label, it has a little plus or a cross by it. And if you look at the bottom, it says for suppression only. Well, that means that when people put it out at 1 year after treatment, it looks good. It looks like they killed the plant. But at 2 years after treatment, most of them come back. So even individual plant treatments with Grazon Next, I'll see a 20% kill versus 80% with the other chemicals that we do recommend. And so that is suppressing the plant, but it usually comes back from the base and that tree is still alive. So very important to understand whether or not you're suppressing something or you're controlling something, and you really can't tell if you've controlled something until 1 or even 2 years after application. All right, so in our booklet, we have this treatment rating control on page 5, and that's where you're going to find out if it says a VH for very high, an H for high, an M for moderate, or an L for low. What the heck does that mean as far as percent of plants killed? So if people are saying, well, I know I'm just going to get low control, but I'm going to try it anyway, that means you get 0 to 35% control. So a 0 is well within the possibility there. So probably not something that they want to be putting money on. And a lot of times our suppression treatments are rated more like low to moderate in this book. But if it's very high, we know it's got more than 76% kill on average, and that's put out under the ideal conditions. And then I also wanted to point out on page 6, we went over a lot of these calculations, but if you need a really quick number for somebody, you got somebody on the phone and they're asking you a lot of questions and they're telling you this is my tank size, how much do I put in it? Here's a very quick chart for individual plant treatments to be able to figure up that percentage amount and how much would need to be dumped into that jug. And then, of course, we have page 3, which goes through all the weed species and brush species that we have in the book. The page numbers correspond to any page that it's referenced as far as some treatment type. So that makes it a little bit more helpful. If you have this as a PDF on your phone or your tablet, you can simply just do the find feature and type in that plant name, and it should find it all throughout the book wherever it's located. For today's example, I want to go over mesquite and specifically Invora treatments that were recently added for grazing lands for mesquite. So you can see mesquite is in there a lot. We've been researching that a lot. It starts on page 25, goes all the way to page 31. So lots of different options to sort through. So here on page 25, you'll see that most of these are basal applications. And then we have some cut stump there at the very bottom. But here you'll see that we've added aminocyclopyrrolachlor and triclopyramine, which if you look back at that chart, that is Invora with an I, brand new herbicide out this year for grazing lands. This is suggesting that you could put that out again in water with 1% MSOOS, just like we covered earlier. That's where you would find it. And then of course it has spray volume, time to apply, and then any other caveats, which includes with Invora that in order to apply that chemical, you need to have that picolinic acid chemistry training completed, which is a 1-hour training that also counts as a laws and regs. So not only do you need your pesticide applicator license for Invora, you also need that 1-hour picolinic acid training. All right, on this page, we can see there's Envora listed a couple of times, once for cut stump and again for a leaf application. And the same deal tells you that for cut stump, you're going to mix that at 8 to 10% in a water carrier with that MSOS at 1%, and exactly how to do that. For the leaf application, you're going to mix for a broadcast rate of 24 to 36 ounces per acre, and individual plant treatments at a 1.5%. So again, that's why we went over how to calculate. IPT would be with a percent, broadcast would be on a per acre basis. So it gets a little bit tricky when you've got somebody on the phone putting you under the gun for coming up with numbers. But notice that both of those, or really all of those with Envora, are listed at a very high control rating, which means it will control 76 to 100% of the trees that it's applied to if it's done correctly as labeled in the comment section on this booklet. And then I also wanted to point out, in case you weren't aware, that we have a publication. It's called ESC 046. Our bookstore likes to come up with odd long numbers. This is also on my website, that's southtexasrangelands.tamu.edu. It's a quick reference for common range and pasture herbicides, and Dr. McGinty led the charge for putting this together, but it's got all our active ingredients, what the trade names might be that people purchase those by, grazing and haying restrictions, rain fast interval, which is like, you ever get those calls from people that are like, we put it out, but then it rained this afternoon. So that'll kind of tell you in general how long that needs to have been on the plant before a rain is acceptable. And then if that chemical requires a pesticide applicator's license or not, which is really handy to have right there at your desk, since that can be pretty overwhelming and confusing with so many chemicals on the market for range and pasture. All right, and that's the end of my section. I'm going to turn it back over to Taylor.
Thank you for participating today. And before you guys sign off, we have a survey that we'll be posting in the chat box for you guys all to fill out if you wouldn't mind. It's only a few questions, and this will help us with developing trainings in the future, and also help figure out what topics you guys would like for us to cover.